Hello and welcome to our lesson on percents. So the word percent has a literal translation. I don't know if this is commonly known, but the word percent literally translates into out of 100. It translates as out of, or sometimes people say per, 100. So when you see, or when you are reading something like 26%, that little symbol after the 26 is our percent symbol. That percent translates to the words out of 100. So when you read 26%, it is literally translating into 26 out of 100. And 26 out of 100 is a fraction with 26 in the numerator and 100 in the denominator. So, since our percentages can literally be translated into fractions, and fractions we know can be converted to decimals, we need to be able to go from any one of those forms to the other. So we've talked about going from fractions to decimals and vice versa. Now we're just throwing a new one into the mix. We should be able to take a percentage and write it as a fraction, or take a percentage and write it as a decimal, and vice versa. Take a decimal or a fraction and make it a percent. So we have to be able to convert or translate or rewrite from one form to another. So let's start with percents. Okay, if we're going to translate percents into decimals and or fractions, we're going to start by translating the percent to a fraction, whether we're trying to get to a fraction or a decimal. So we're going to translate it just like I showed you a second ago to a fraction out of 100. And then, if we need to keep it in fraction form, we'll make sure it's simplified. If not, then if we need to get to a decimal, then we're going to translate the fraction to a decimal. And we do that using the place value that the fraction is in. Sorry, let's say hundredths place. This isn't always going to be true, but it's okay. I'll show you what I mean with that in just a second. So we can translate the decimal. Using the fraction that's out of 100, we can directly translate to a decimal that's in the hundredths place. If we reduce it down, it might not be as easy, so I think we'll stick with that hundredths place. Okay, so let's look at some examples now that I've probably confused you on the wording. My apologies. 27%. So 27% has a direct translation. It means 27 out of 100. So if I said write it as a fraction, boom, you're done. And that can't even be reduced. There aren't any common factors for 27 and 100, so that would be your fraction form. And then if I said make it a decimal, well, 27 out of 100 is 27 hundredths, right? So if I wanted to make this a decimal, this would be 27 in the, I don't know why I couldn't write that, 27 in the hundredths place of the decimal, okay, of the number. So 27 out of 100 is 27 hundredths. So again, 27 in the hundredths place is our decimal. Okay, same thing for 3%. 3% translates to 3 out of 100. That is the fraction in simplest form. So if I said write it as a fraction, boom, you're done. And no common factors, so we can't reduce it. And then again, this is 3 hundredths, 3 100ths, which that's represented there. So we would put 3 in the hundredths place of our decimal. Pretty straightforward. Okay, now sometimes there's some things that make this look a little strange, like 109%. Still translates the same way. 109% would be 109 hundredths. Now, recognize that 109 hundredths is more than 1. That's 100 out of 100, and then an additional 9 out of 100. So you can kind of think about this. Think about this as being 100 over 100, and then there's an extra 9 out of 100, right? So when I go to make this a decimal, 109 hundredths would be a full 1, and then that extra 9 in the hundredths place. So it's 1.09 as a decimal, okay? 30%. 30% translates to 30 out of 100, and 30 out of 100 would be 30 in the hundredths place, so 0.30. Now both of those technically can be simplified. This would simplify, I know I could divide both the top and the bottom of the fraction there by 10. So if I divide by 10 on the top, I'm going to be left with 3. If I divide by 10 on the bottom, I'm going to be left with 10. So 3/10 would be the preferred fraction form. That'd be the simplified fraction form. And then 0.30 isn't wrong, but you probably wouldn't see that extra 0, so just a 0.3 would be probably what you would be looking at in that one. Okay, so let me just, now that I'm boxing in answers, I got to go back and box in my other answers. And these are all technically answers. Goodness. Okay, so let's look at 1.5%, another example. Again, 1.5% means we have 1.5 out of 100. And let's remember that it's not really proper to leave a decimal within a fraction, and so it would, to fix this, in the same way we can multiply the top, or divide both the top and the bottom of a fraction by 10 to reduce it, we can multiply the top and bottom of a fraction by 10 to, let's say, get rid of a decimal. So if I multiplied the top and the bottom of the fraction by 10, if I multiplied by 10 here, multiplied by 10 here, then 1.5 times 10 is going to move that decimal and make it 15. And 100 times 10, again, that's going to move that decimal. That's going to make that 1,000. So 15 out of 1,000. From there, it's a little easier to go to my decimal form. If I have 15 out of 1,000, 15 in the thousandths place is my decimal. So my decimal should be 0.015. So there's my decimal form. And then I'm going to go a little further with the fraction here because I know that this reduces. I can actually divide the top and the bottom of this particular fraction by 5. So if I reduce by 5, divide by 5 on the top, I'm going to get 3. And then divide by 5 on the bottom, I'm going to get 200. And that's going to be the simplest form of my fraction there. Okay? And that, I know that some of these might be a little tricky, and I understand 100%. Remember that this these are skills that we should be able to operate with by hand, but we do have calculators that help us with these things as well. So when you're looking at 1.5 over 100 and you're confused about what to do, you can always turn to your calculator to say, hey, fix that for me. So if you put in 1.5 over 100, it's going to give you the decimal, so that's nice. Your fraction can go right to a decimal. And if you hit the fraction button in blue over here, then it would actually simplify that fraction for you as well. Okay? So if you can get it translated out of 100, then the calculator can do the rest of the work for you. So same thing with like the 109%. You know the translation. That's the important part. Know that 109% translates into 109 out of 100. So then you could put it into your calculator and it would give you the decimal, and then you can confirm by hitting the fraction button that you have the same fraction, that it's reduced, that it's in its simplest form. Okay? All right, let's try one more here. 210% is going to translate into 210 out of 100. And I'm going to reduce this one as well. Let's see, I can at least divide by 10. So let's see if that's going to be good here. Dividing the top by 10 is going to get me 21. So I have 21, and then dividing the bottom by 10 gives me 10. So 21 out of 10 is not going to have anything else in common. That's going to be the simplest form of my fraction. Now this is again one where we have a bigger number on the top, right? An improper fraction. That means our decimal amount should have some whole numbers in it. So think about what this is. 21 tenths is like 10 over 10, and another 10 over 10, and then some leftover 1 over 10, right? There's 21 tenths altogether. So what you have is 2 wholes there. So your decimal form is going to be 2, and then you have 1/10 left. So 1 in the tenths place of the decimal. So 2.1 is going to be the decimal. And again, let's just confirm 210 out of 100. Get 2.1 as our decimal. Let's hit the little fraction button and see that 21 tenths is our reduced fraction. Okay? So that's converting. The important part here is that you can translate that percent symbol into a fraction out of 100. That's the key part, because the calculator can do the rest of the work for you. Okay? Now, let's try going in reverse here. If we have fractions and we want to convert them to percents, sometimes that's pretty straightforward, like in number 7. Number 7, we have 17 out of 100. So if we already have a fraction out of 100, then we can go straight to saying that is 17%. Okay? That doesn't take any fancy work. Now, if it's not, like the rest of these fractions, what I like to do is make a proportion. So for example, here on 1/4, I'm trying to figure out what that percent is out of 100. What is the number out of 100? Well, if I make a proportion, if I figure out what 1/4, 1 to 4 is to x out of 100, then I can find my percent. So what is this with respect to out of 100, which is what I'm trying to find? So I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm going to make a proportion with the given fraction set equal to x, or n if you prefer the variable n. Oh, sorry. Like, what am I missing? Set equal to n out of 100. We're looking for some percent out of 100. And so n is going to represent the percent that we're looking for. Okay, the goal is to make it look like a fraction like this first one, where we can just translate. Once we have it out of 100, then we can translate to our percent. Okay, so let's try that here. I'm trying to figure out 1 out of 4 is to what number out of 100. That's going to tell me what my percent is. Because I know that once I have this proportion set up, it's cross-multiplying to solve. So this is 4 times n equal to 1 times 100 is 100. So to solve this, we're going to divide both sides by 4. If I divide by 4 on both sides, I know that n has to be 25. So that means, if I rewrote this, that means 1 out of 4 is the same as 25 out of 100. And 25 out of 100 is 25%. Okay, 25%. This was 17%. Let's start boxing. Now I want to box everything. All right, let's try that again here. That one worked out kind of nicely. They don't always work out so perfectly. Again, I'm going to make this a proportion. 1 is to 3 as what is to 100. 1 out of 3 is what out of 100. That's going to give me my percent. So I'm going to cross multiply. 3 times n is 3n. And 1 times 100 is 100. So 3n equals 100. Now when I go to divide this time, 3 doesn't divide exactly into 100. That's okay. This is going to cancel and tell me n is going to be equal to, when I divide 100 by 3, we're going to get a repeating decimal. That's, again, it's totally okay. It's 33.3 repeating. That 3 repeats. So we're going to say that 1 out of 3 is 33.3 repeating out of 100, which I know it's weird to look at that and it's not really proper, but the goal here was to get to a percent. So if we're at 33.3 out of 100, then that is 33.3 repeating percent. Okay, and if you wanted to just round that and just say it's approximately 33.3% without the repeating symbol, that would be acceptable as well. Okay, let's try again. We're going to say 5 is to 12 as what is to 100. Let's figure out what that is out of 100. Cross multiplying here, we get 12n. Cross multiplying here, we get 500. So 12n is going to equal 500. Let's divide both sides by 12. That's going to reduce, and n is going to be equal to 500 divided by 12. It's 41.6 repeating this time. So 41.6 repeating. So this is saying that 5 out of 12 is the same thing as 41.6 repeating out of 100, which means it is 41.6 repeating percent. And again, that would be a totally fine answer if you wanted to round that and say it's about 41.7%. That would be fine as well. Okay, moving right along. This time we have an improper fraction. Anytime it's improper, we got a number bigger than 1, we should have a percentage over 100. And again, we can use our cross-multiplying technique. 3 is to 2 as n is to 100. If we cross-multiply here, 2 times n is 2n. Cross-multiply here, we get 300. Those cross products have to be equal. We're going to divide both sides by 2. This one works out kind of nicely for us. 300 divided by 2 is going to be exactly 150. So that means 3 out of 2 is the same as 150 out of 100. And 150 out of 100 is exactly 150%. Okay? One more, and if you're feeling confident here, this would be a good place for you to pause the video and try this out. Otherwise, you can just let me keep going here. So 15 is to 16 as n is to 100. If we cross multiply, 16n there, and then 15 times 100 is going to be 1500 there. Going to divide both sides by 16. And I am not trying to do that division. Let's go to our friend the calculator. 1,500 divided by 16 is going to be 93.75. And so what we're saying is that 15 out of 16 is the same as 93.75 out of 100. So 93.75 out of 100 is literally translated to 93.75%. Okay? And I know you don't necessarily have to take all those steps every time, as long as you understand that once you've gotten here, you basically have your percent. Okay? So I think the fractions are a little more work than the decimals. Now I'm going to show you the decimal, and then there's a shortcut for this one that you've probably seen before. But if we're going to convert decimals to percents, the first thing we're going to do is write the decimal as a fraction using its place value. Write the decimal as a fraction using its place value. Okay. From there, you can follow the same steps that we were just using. So for example, 0.65, that's 65 in the hundredths place of the decimal, which means rewritten as a fraction, this is 65 hundredths. Well, that's not going to take any fancy work. 65 out of 100 is exactly 65%. Okay. Now, if you look at the next one, we have 216 thousandths. So if I was to rewrite this as a fraction, it's 216 out of 1,000. Okay, 216 out of 1,000. And now that is not a direct translation to a percent. I can use the process then that I looked at just a few minutes ago. Right? I can say 216 out of 1,000 is n out of 100, and I can cross multiply to solve. And then you're going to see something happen here. So n times 1,000 is 1,000n, and 216 times 100 is 216 with an extra 2 zeros there. If I divide my 1,000 over, what's going to happen is, you're going to see it, 216, 21,600 divided by 1,000. Just moves the decimal and makes this 21.6. So if n is 21.6, then this is going to be 21.6%. Okay? Now, maybe you're seeing the 65 here, and you're seeing the 65 here, and you're seeing 216 here and 216 here. All that's happening is we are moving the decimal. That's a little shortcut on this. To go from a decimal to a percent, the decimal just needs to move 2 places to the right. So a shortcut, if you want to commit this to memory, sometimes we have a hard time remembering shortcuts or which way the decimal goes, so I prefer understanding what you're doing, but if you're good with shortcuts, I'm good with them too. Shortcut, okay, is move the decimal right 2 times. Right 2 places. Okay, and that's not a sentence. So, if I'm looking at this last example here, right now my decimal is right here after the 4. 4 is the same thing as 4.0. So if or 0, as many zeros as I want, if I took that decimal and just moved it 2 places, what I would be looking at is 400 as my percent. Okay, so that's shortcut. Now that confuses people, I know. If you're totally fine with that, then so am I. But let me show you the process just in case. So 4 as a fraction is 4 out of 1. Now if I did this one to be out of 100, this is going to equal n out of 100, this one's a pretty easy one to solve, right? Because 1 times n is n, and 4 times 100 is 400. So I'm looking at, again, 400%. So the work of it is not that bad, but I think the shortcut is nice if, again, you can commit it to memory and know what you're doing moving the decimal. In my experience, I've seen that confuse people. But up to you. And again, you can use your calculator to work on some of this, right? So 0.216, your calculator can turn into a fraction for you, but how do you take that and make it a percent? You have to go back to the fractional work unless you can remember that you're just moving the decimal. So it's up to you, but you got to be able to go back and forth from percents to fractions to decimals in any combination there. So hopefully you've got enough to work on your practice. So go ahead and get started there, and then if you need any additional help, feel free to reach out. Until next time, take care.